Shall we go?
Sure.
Okay, let's do it here. Folks, I'd like to welcome you here. Amazing debate we're going to have tonight. Good conversation. You know, so often I think when it comes to the gun control issue, by the way, I'm Bill Meyer from KMED. I'm the moderator, sort of the buffer. You know, we don't expect fisticuffs to break out tonight, but if so, I'll duck and let them do it. But seriously, thanks for coming tonight. We're going to have a good conversation on Second Amendment, firearms rights, gun safety, all the rest of it, and maybe we'll learn something. So often when people have said that we want to have a conversation, a lot of it has been about, well, no, really one side wants to dictate to the other. I think it's really what's been going on for a long time. Let's see if we can find some common ground or solidify our positions by the time we leave tonight. It's hard to say. And I'd like to introduce first off the charity that we're sponsoring tonight and also encourage you to donate to Helping Hands International. And Ron Ashpole. Oh, there you are, Ron. Ron, come on up and say a few words about your organization, okay?
Am I Michaelis? Am I here?
Well, you can come up here if you wanted. Yeah, you get the lectern. In fact, I might just hand it to you, okay? Well, I guess I can't hand it. There we go. Do that.
Perfect. Good evening. Nice to see you guys. I'm very honored to have Helping Hands International selected as the beneficiary of this debate. I'm not sure why we got chosen, but I'm thankful. Helping Hands International is a nonprofit, faith-based organization. We send teams all around the world, bringing help and hope to hurting people and sharing the love of God through practical, hands-on care. We drill wells in Africa and do orphanage outreach in India and build houses in Mexico and all kinds of stuff around the world, as well as disaster relief around the U.S. We sent 7 teams to Houston, Texas last fall to help with the flooding in Texas. We also do a local project every summer. We do a mini home makeover for a needy family or other organizations. So we try to do some things locally and nationally and internationally all around the world. Our hope is to make a difference. And so I just appreciate your support. There's some brochures in the back if you want to learn more about us, and any support that you can give us would be much appreciated. So thanks a lot.
If I can just throw in real quick, I just wanted to let everyone know, me and Brian both, when we were talking, organizing this event, I told him I really wanted to, sponsor a charity, and he agreed, thought that'd be a good idea. I just know this can be a contentious issue, and so, as much as possible, I would, really like for us to realize that we all, no matter what side of the debate we're on, we do want people to be safe. We want to help people. None of us are evil, hopefully. So we picked a charity and wanted to sponsor them. I'm going to be giving $40 to them, so I just would really encourage anybody here, if you have some money, please make a donation. They do good work.
All right. Here we go. We're going to introduce the speakers right now, and representing the pro-gun control side of the debate is Brian Josephson. Now, something I just found out about you, which I didn't realize, you were one of 3 Oregon presidential scholars, huh?
That's correct. That's news to me, too. I just found out yesterday.
Oh, okay. So breaking news here at the debate. We appreciate that. Let me tell you a little bit about Brian, besides the fact that he is a Oregon presidential scholar. He's a student at South Medford High School and the organizer of the Medford March for Our Lives, which recently occurred here. Brian believes that we have not done enough to protect our communities from gun violence, and that there is far more than we can do to help in our communities as well as in our governments to protect American lives. Now, Brian is looking for greater participation in the NICS background check system. That's one of the issues he's been pushing across the nation, and also stricter controls for firearms ownership. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Josephson. Put it together. All right. Now, representing the anti-gun control side of the debate is David Kirk West. Now, David is a pretty interesting cat, too. He's a filmmaker, libertarian activist, lives in Klamath Falls. Boy, that's a long drive to come over here for this, huh?
It's worth it.
All right. With his wife, Cassie, and their 2 young children, Scarlett and Kirk, David is the writer and director of the pro-gun short film, actually several of them, including One Man's Terrorist and Liberation. His best-known work is the infamous Ghost Gun video takedown of California Senator Kevin De Leon. That was an interesting story in and of itself, wasn't it? An unwavering proponent of individual human liberty and an everyday no days off handgun carrier, David opposes all proposed gun control legislation and would like to see the repeal of the 1934 NFA Act, also the institution of nationwide permitless, or sometimes known as constitutional carry. So David Kirk West. And this is going to be, like I was saying a little earlier, just a little loosey-goosey. This is not some informal thing which we're going to tear the microphone away from somebody if they go a little over time, things like that. But we're going to give each of them, was it 5 minutes on an opening statement?
Yes.
Yeah, 5 minutes on opening remarks. And Brian, we'll turn it over to you first.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. As the moderator said, Mr. Meyer, my name is Brian Josephson. I'm a student at South Medford High School. I was born and raised here in the Valley, and I organized the Medford March for Our Lives. I'm also a student at South Medford High School. I think I already said that. Sorry about that. And the topic tonight is gun reform. I think it's time to face some facts about gun reform and gun violence in America. America has a gun violence problem. We have more gun violence than any other developed nation in the world. Our gun violence rate puts us above such good company as Israel, a nation that lives in a state of civil war. 13,000 people die every year in the United States because of firearm homicide. Our suicide rate is 1 in 25, with over 50% of successful suicides being completed with a firearm. That's a problem that cannot be missed in this debate. About 1 in 20 suicide attempts are successful. However, studies suggest that between 7 in 10 and 9 in 10 attempts by firearm are successful. Even if you take the low end, firearm suicides are 14 times more likely to be successful than the general population. Some people play down the firearms deaths issue. They say it's not that many. But with a death rate of about 12 per 100,000, that's more than breast cancer at 10 in every 100,000 people in the United States. There are marches, shirts, and buttons for that problem, and there should be ones for this one too. And it's not just the quantity of the problem, but the magnitude of the problem with which we talk about tonight. Every attack, every death is an assault on our most basic right, the right to life. Without that, there are no other rights. It is an attack on our most basic American principles. So long as we say that working hard to get ahead, that's the American dream, but we do nothing to stop the slaughter of children in our schools, we are letting that dream languish. It is clear to me that something must be done to combat this uniquely American problem. We need universal background checks for firearms in this nation. No loopholes for private sales, gun shows, or anything else. If you want a gun, we should check for violence, domestic abuse. We need more intensive permitting. Take Massachusetts. Their laws, upheld in federal court, ban such rifles as AR-15s, and that's not what I'm calling for, but they also require the training to own a firearm, and they require identification before you can purchase one. Massachusetts has the lowest gun death rate in the nation. We need tighter restrictions on magazine capacities, because 2 seconds can be life and death in a massacre. We need adequate funding for mental health care and security in our schools, as well as in our community, because these issues are not just about firearms, they're about mental health too. These are how we solve America's gun violence problem. As for the Constitution, current jurisprudence says that the laws I've listed tonight do not fly in the face of the Second Amendment. As you listen to arguments tonight, my opponent will create grandiose illusions that my ideas of this are so-called government control, and that the government is ineffective. They cannot protect us, but simultaneously they are so effective that they can strip us of our most basic rights. These ideas run counter to each other. It can be either one or the other, but it cannot be both. The government is either effective or ineffective. I know that the government can be effective when it is well managed, and that is why there must be restrictions on the government. The Second Amendment is that restriction, and we should work within it. Every idea tonight will, from my side, fall under the Second Amendment. Thank you.
All right, David, your opening remarks now.
Alrighty, so I do want to apologize. I worked about 120 hours this last week, so I am going to have to read my opening remarks. So, my name is David West. I'm a filmmaker and libertarian activist who was born and raised right here in the great state of Jefferson. I currently live in Klamath Falls with my wife Cassie and our 2 young children, Scarlett and Kirk, who I think they are sitting in the very back right now. I can't see them. Anyway, tonight I'm here to debate Mr. Josephson on the topic of gun rights. But I think that what we're really debating are human rights. You see, as a libertarian, I believe that all humans have inherent and inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. These 3 basic rights cover the entire spectrum of human freedom. Because of our right to life, we should be free to defend ourselves against aggressive violence. Because of our right to liberty, no one should stop us from doing as we please as long as we aren't hurting anyone. And because of our right to property, we should be able to own anything we want regardless of whether or not we need it. As a Christian, I believe that we were imbued with these rights by our Creator. But you don't need to share my religious convictions to believe that these are rights that should be recognized for all humans. All you need to do is look out at the world and realize 2 self-evident truths. Firstly, that everyone owns their own body. And second, that violence against people who aren't hurting anyone is disgusting. Once you realize these 2 things, it becomes quite clear that all humans do indeed have a right to life, liberty, and property. And by extension, that means that people have an absolute, inherent right to own firearms. Thankfully for us, we live in one of the only countries in the world that explicitly recognizes that right in its constitution. Now, not only do I oppose any and all proposed gun control legislation, be it assault weapons bans, gun registries, magazine capacity limits, or increased background checks, I actually oppose all current gun control laws as well. You should never need a background check to purchase an inanimate object. The 1934 National Firearms Act should be done away with so that automatic weapons, short-barreled rifles and shotguns, and suppressors are easily and affordably available. People should be able to carry a concealed handgun everywhere without any permit at all. Gun rights aren't just for Americans. Because gun rights are human rights, they should belong to all people of all nations, and every nation that deprives their citizens of this fundamental human liberty is in the wrong. Probably most controversially of all, I even believe that any felon who can be trusted enough to be released from prison should have their full gun rights restored. Now, I imagine that last statement scared even a few of you who are on my side. To be honest, I hesitated putting it in here because of that very reason. But in the end I did, because that is how certain I am that what I am going to say to you tonight is right. If you're sincerely on the fence about this issue, or if you're anti-gun but willing to open your mind and listen to a different point of view, I believe that what I am saying tonight will convince you of 4 primary things. 1, that the proliferation of firearms in the United States is nowhere near as closely tied to the murder rate as the anti-gun side of this debate would have you believe. 2, that the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution has nothing to do with hunting and was indeed intended to guarantee Americans unfettered access to all forms of weaponry. 3, that guns, and in particular so-called assault weapons, are genuinely fantastic defensive tools and that banning them would hurt society's most vulnerable members the most. And 4, that gun control is an immoral act of aggressive violence with truly terrible unintended consequences that will hurt and oppress innocent people and do next to nothing to prevent crime. Thank you very much. I look forward to changing some of your minds.
All right, very good. So this is really a format at first in which the 2 of you ask one another questions. So, Brian, we'll give you the first bite of the apple, if that's okay.
Okay. So, David, when you say that the Second Amendment was intended to, not intended for hunting, what, in your opinion, is the Second Amendment intended for?
Well, I think you need to remember that the Second Amendment was written by people who had just overthrown an oppressive government. So as much as people don't like to hear that, that is exactly what the Second Amendment was intended for. It was intended to give free people the right to be armed to protect themselves from potential invaders, from other citizens, or even from a tyrannical government.
Okay.
Any follow-up questions?
Why didn't they put it in the original Constitution if they were so concerned about it?
That's a good question. Again, I think you need to remember that there were people that would have rather stuck with the Articles of Confederation than gone to the much more centralized control of the Second Amendment. There were certainly founding fathers that we do not want to emulate. Alexander Hamilton would have, had us have a king if he had his way. So there were some founding fathers that obviously wanted more control, and then there were some founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson that were like, hey, you know what? We've created this Constitution. Can we at least get a Bill of Rights in here that recognizes some of the rights that we should never be taking away from our citizens?
Okay.
Oh,
I think I'm
okay.
good.
All right. Yeah, I would add those that the Bill of Rights, something that I've talked about on the show several years. The Bill of Rights was actually there to buy off the cooperation of the Anti-Federalists who didn't want the
Who didn't want the
the
or who didn't want the
Constitution.
Constitution. Right.
Yeah, they didn't want
wanted
to
the
go with it.
articles.
Okay, David, you want to ask a question to Brian?
Yeah, so I think the first question I would ask Brian is, my understanding is that you support an assault weapons ban, and so I just want to go right out of the gate, ask you, how would you define an assault weapon, and why do you think that they need to be banned?
I don't support an assault weapons ban. I support greater licensing for all firearms. All firearms.
So could you describe, in your ideal world, how does that system work exactly?
I think that system looks very close to what Massachusetts has. So you go in and you, when you want to buy a firearm, you get a firearm identification. And so that is your background check, and then it is also your ID, so to speak, when you are purchasing a firearm in the state of Massachusetts. But beyond that, the sheriff who issues that firearms ID has the option to deny or approve the ID. And if that ID is approved, then you may go buy the firearm. If that ID is not approved, there is a chance for legal recourse. You can go to a judge, and the judge can decide whether or not the sheriff who made the decision was making a decision that was correct, that made sense. And so that's what I would like to see for all firearms, not just handguns. I want to see that across the board.
So do you also support, you mentioned restrictions on magazine capacity sizes, yes?
Correct.
And do you support, because Massachusetts does also have what is essentially an assault weapons ban.
They do.
Which is based on features. Do you want something like that, or you just want increased licensing and magazine
I
regulations?
don't think a ban on features will work. You can go out and you can buy a .22, and because it's wood and doesn't look scary, then you're going to have a gun that can do nearly as much damage as an AR-15, but you're talking about something that wouldn't be classified as a assault rifle because it doesn't have a pistol grip, or it doesn't have a threaded barrel. So I don't think it'll be effective.
I give you credit. That's a lot more than most people on the anti-gun side of the debate, even know about firearms. They will, they'll turn a blind eye to a Mini 14 and then ban an AR-15, not realizing that functionally these are essentially, the same firearm. So let me ask you this then. In this ideal system you're talking about, you think it's so reasonable that we can just, you can appeal it to the law. But what is appealing something to a court if you've been denied the right to buy a firearm? What does that do for somebody who is trying to go out, say a woman go out and buy a firearm to defend herself against an abusive ex? How is that going to help her if she has to wait weeks or months to get a firearm?
So I think that's what you have to look at is the rate at which these things happen. We have temporary restraining orders that can take effect very quickly, and that's an option for her. And so we have to look at weighing the options between the firearms and being in some states, if you don't pass the background check or you get waitlisted, whatever, you can just buy the gun after a certain period of hours has elapsed. And that's a mistake in our background system, and I think that needs to be fixed.
All right, let's turn it over to you, Brian. Time for you to ask a few questions yourself.
So if the Second Amendment is intended to fight against a tyrannical government, why is a well-regulated militia, according to what is, in my opinion, the most eloquent and available defense of the Constitution, according to the Federalist Papers, why is a well-regulated militia the most natural defense for a free country, and ought to be under the regulation and disposal of that body which is constituted the guardian of national security. He is referring to Congress having control to organize, arm, and train the militia.
Well, I think you need to look a little bit deeper at some of the stuff from the time. I would I would not consider the Federalist Papers something that I am particularly a fan of. I mean, remember, it was the Anti-Federalists were the ones that really pushed for the Bill of Rights. In the parlance of the time, militia was used to refer to basically just adult men, like 16 to 45 is what a lot of the literature will refer to it as, who are not part of the government, who are not part of the official, government military. And well-regulated essentially means well-equipped. So that would, when it says a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of the free state, it's essentially saying a well-armed population not in the employ of the government is necessary for the security of a free state. And I mean, certainly at the time, there is an element to where the government would want to have that so that they could raise those people in the event of an invasion, but it was never intended to be just, the equivalent. Acting like the National Guard is the equivalent of a well-regulated militia in the, circa 1791 sense is just silly.
Any follow-ups, David?
I'm
sorry.
That's all right.
Brian, I'll get them down by the end here.
So in that same Federalist 29, Hamilton says that the militia should be a small to moderate-sized corps. And so I think, do you not think that flies in the face of the parlance being just any able-bodied man between 17 or 18 and 35?
I mean, again, there was a reason I bashed on Hamilton specifically at the start of this. He was arguably one of the worst of all the founding fathers. He wanted a king. Is this the guy that we're going to let define everything? Remember, the Bill of Rights was put in there to woo people like Thomas Jefferson, the anti-federalists, into going along with the much stronger controls that the Constitution put over the country than the Articles of Confederation did. And so I think what we're seeing here is, even at the time, there was a little bit of a disagreement between in politics. There were people that wanted a stronger federal government, and there were people that wanted armed citizens. But I think that even Alexander Hamilton would think the idea of throwing somebody in jail because they bought a firearm without the government's permission would be ludicrous. I don't think, quibbling over his definition of militia and his argument as to why a militia is important really has a lot of bearing in this conversation.
Okay.
All right, David.
So, since we're talking about the Second Amendment right now might be a good time to go into some things I wanted to share with you. I'll get into that, but I'll ask Brian a question first. So, Brian, why exactly don't you feel, or I guess I should ask, do you feel like the Second Amendment gives us an absolute right to own guns and needs to be revised, or do you feel like the Second Amendment never gave us that right in the first place?
I truly believe that the Second Amendment was intended for the protection of the state, and to me it seems pretty clear that that was the understanding of what the militia's purpose was at the time. I think the decision in D.C. v. Heller that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to bear firearms, I think that was a mistake, and I disagree with that jurisprudence. I'm sure we will be disagreeing with some of the court's decisions all night long, and that's one that I disagree with, and
So for the most part, the Bill of Rights are individual rights, though. So you could argue that the 10th Amendment is, which basically gives the states the right to regulate things that the federal government doesn't have. But for the most part, the Bill of Rights is supposed to keep the federal government and also the states that are agreeing to be part of the United States of America. It's to keep them from taking rights from citizens. So why would it be that the Second Amendment is just randomly in there, unlike all the others, to protect the state and not to protect citizens from the state?
Well, as you noted first, I don't think it's randomly in there. I think it ties much more closely to the 10th Amendment than it does any other amendment in the Bill of Rights. But furthermore, the Bill of Rights was not meant as a constraint on the states. The Bill of Rights didn't become applicable to the states until what's called the incorporation doctrine of the 14th Amendment. And so until after the Civil War, the Bill of Rights didn't apply to those states that it was meant to protect in some ways, as in the 14th or as in the 10th Amendment, and I think as in the Second Amendment.
I notice you thinking.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think
Okay, all right.
there's a clear fundamental disagreement on this. I mean, I would argue that the Bill of Rights was always intended to apply to the states as well, not just the federal government. And the 14th Amendment was more, rectifying and clarifying that. But that's
I suppose the general understanding is that it didn't apply to the states. You see the reference specifically to Congress shall not make any law in the First Amendment, and you can go down the list.
All right. If you don't mind, I'm going to inject a couple of questions.
Sounds
myself
good.
Here,
Yeah.
if you don't mind. I'm kind of curious about, Brian, I'll ask you one here first, about there's been a lot of focus on the militia, and do you think it's rational that founders, even whether you were a Federalist or an anti-Federalist back at the time, whether you thought the Articles were great or the Constitution was a much better way, they just ended up fighting a war of revolution
Right.
against the greatest military power of its time.
Right.
Do you think that that the Second Amendment had more to do with that, or that it was just more of a protecting the free states only?
I truly do believe that it was for protection of the free states and against the federal government. Hamilton, in Federalist 29, I'm going to be referencing it a lot. It is the thing that mentions specifically the militia. Hamilton says that a militia is a state's best defense against the federal government, and that if the federal government, for example, called them to serve and attack another state, it would be absolutely absurd that they would just follow that blindly.
Yeah, but there are also two militias too. There's the regulated militia and then the unregulated militia, which would be the people. The regulated militia, more of the National Guard or Army. I wanted to ask you something, David. You talked about wanting to have no restrictions whatsoever. You're just thinking that even if you even yourself admitted that that you were concerned about putting this in there, that even if you were a felon, you get your gun rights back, et cetera, that shouldn't be that way. How does that comport with Supreme Court justices who have said that the Constitution is not a suicide pact? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that one thing that should be, that we do need to note here is that not everyone has obviously the same high regard for the government as some people do. I think obviously you're seeing that Brian puts a lot more stock in the government than I do. I will argue that the Second Amendment is the government recognizing the right of the people to keep and bear arms. But ultimately, like I mentioned earlier, I believe that we're talking about natural human rights here that have existed since long before the U.S. government existed, since the dawn of time. And also that, ultimately our rights come from our Creator or nature, whatever you want to argue it. So I'm a little bit at a loss here to argue with some of this stuff because I don't particularly care what, Alexander Hamilton said. I don't care at all what Alexander Hamilton said. I care what the intention of the Second Amendment was only insofar as it allows us to fight the government on its own terms. But, ultimately, I believe that gun rights are human rights.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Absolutely.
If it is the intention that the Second Amendment is meant to protect our right to fight the government, why is it treason to wage war against the government?
Well, I think you need to remember, of course it's going to be treason to fight the government, but you need to remember that that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Would we call Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Klaus von Stauffenberg traitors for fighting the Third Reich? Maybe we'd call them traitors, but we'd also call them heroes. Yes. So to me, traitor is a hollow word. Traitors something that is defined by, one side of a conflict and is completely different on the other side.
Isn't it also codified by the Constitution, which says treason shall consist of waging war against the United States?
I'm not particularly familiar with that part, I suppose.
Thank you.
If that's the case, then perhaps our founders should have hanged too?
The courts would disagree, I suppose.
Just for bringing it up.
I mean, right. I mean, the only reason the founders aren't remembered as traitors is because they won the war. Otherwise, right.
And they wrote a constitution about it.
So does that mean that just anything the government does, it's bad to fight against them?
I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that, in general, there are definitely some odious parts of our founding constitution, but slavery, for example. But in general, I think the Constitution represents the feeling of the time, and it represents the feeling of the people that ratified that Constitution in all of the states. We forget that they were coming from the Articles of Confederation, and so every state had to ratify that Constitution.
I think David asked the last question, or did you ask the last question?
I asked last question.
Okay, then we'll let David do it. I want to be fair about it.
All right then. Well, I'm trying to think. It's tough because you don't have exactly the same views on things like assault weapons ban as a lot of people on your side do. So I guess I'll just ask you then, what would you want to see done to somebody who went out and, sold a gun to their cousin without going through a NICS background check?
I think that any firearm purchase, regardless of the situation of that purchase, if that firearm purchase occurs without a background check, I think that purchase should be subject to a Class C felony.
So that doesn't entirely answer my question, though. What do you want to see done to them? Does that mean you want to see them punished?
So that would look like a fine, probably on the first offense, or up to I suppose up to 2 years in prison, and but really, I think a fine on the first offense and stepping up from there if they continually do this unlicensed transfer of firearms.
So does it not bother you at all that laws like that would probably be enforced disproportionately against poor people and minorities? I have a statistic here from Radley Balco, who's a great Washington Post contributor, great libertarian. And it basically says that 47% on average of federal gun convictions are against black people. Black people represent 12.3% of the American population. This is a grossly disproportionate statistic that I think shows clearly unfair enforcement. So, what would you say to the fact that the policies that you are talking about here would have negative unintended consequences against the most vulnerable demographics in society?
I think this speaks to a very different issue. It's how many places do policing, and I think we should look at that as well, but I would say that's not entirely the purpose of tonight's debate, but I'll indulge it. So what I would say is that, in some places we definitely have issues with how we do policing. You look at community policing being much more effective than more of a just like we are here to reign over you style of policing. And so looking at redoing how we train police, I think, is much better than looking at how our laws exist. Because if we said, oh, we shouldn't have a murder law because it's disproportionately affecting black people, I think that would be a poor decision. And that's, to me, what you're saying. You're saying we shouldn't have this law because it might disproportionately affect black people.
Well, the difference is that murder is a real crime. Murder is depriving someone of everything they have.
Let's go with theft then. Or let's go with something. Let's go with
something victimless.
Yeah. Let's go with opioid distribution.
Another thing that I would support being legal.
So opioids cause countless deaths in our communities. They're unregulated, and quite frankly, they drive people to do things that they wouldn't do otherwise. And that kind of addiction, it causes a loss. But we shouldn't stop policing opioids because of how they are enforced disproportionately. We should start enforcing the law in an appropriate manner.
All right. Why don't you take a question or two here?
So you say, would you say that the National Firearms Act is unconstitutional?
Yeah, I think shall not be infringed is pretty clear. And more than that, I would just say again, even if it was constitutional, that wouldn't mean a whole lot to me because ultimately it's immoral. You know, if any of you are familiar with Ruby Ridge, an innocent woman, an innocent 14-year-old boy, and also a federal agent were killed because of, you know, the National Firearms Act. That whole debacle went down because the ATF tricked Randy Weaver into selling them a shotgun that had been cut off to be just a, you know, quarter-inch too short. So.
The public library will close in 20 minutes. If you need to fly for library cards, please go to the circulation desk on the first floor.
You get an extra 10 seconds.
Anyway, so what I was going to say was, you know, that's a perfect, or the Branch Davidians. That happened because of the ATF trying to enforce the National Firearms Act and make themselves look good. So you need to remember there are grave, grave consequences to laws like that. But I'll let you continue your question. Sorry to sidetrack a little.
So would you support owning a bomb, for example?
Sure, I would. Explosives have a lot of applications in things like mining and industrial work. And people always go to, you know, oh, would you let people own a bomb? Would you let people own a nuke? And my answer to that is, most countries can't even get nukes. Why are we worried about people getting them? You know, but if Elon Musk wanted to build a nuclear reactor for some awesome project, I would certainly be a lot more comfortable with that than with governments having them. I mean, remember, governments are the only ones that have actually killed civilians with nuclear weapons. I mean, to me, it again goes back to a fundamental question about who do you trust more? The people who, the organization, the idea, rather, the state that killed tens of millions of people throughout the 20th century, hundreds of millions even, or people who run the gamut from awful to good, but mostly exist somewhere towards the good side. And ultimately, I trust people a lot more than I trust the government.
All right. I wanted to interject and ask a couple of questions myself, and then we might actually get some questions from the audience here too. This is something I was thinking about the other day, Brian. I direct this to you. Police have no duty to protect. You're familiar with that, right? There's no duty or obligation to protect the people, right?
Right.
Okay, good. Yeah,
But
so
no constitutionally required duty. Correct.
okay, yeah, there's no duty, and if they do protect, hey, it's a great thing. No one's complaining. All right. How does that knowledge though square with increasing restrictions on lawful firearm ownership in the United States? How does that protect people in a time when we know that police are not required to protect you?
So they're required to follow the law, and so if they don't, they get punished for that. And so that is something that we have to look at. But we should create laws that reflect the morals of our society. And across the board, over 90% of people support universal background checks on firearm purchases. This is not extreme. We should have laws that reflect that. And so it's the police's job to enforce our laws.
Okay.
And so as long as we have laws that reflect the morals and we have laws against police brutality and abuses of power, then we can remedy the problem if there is one, but usually just prevent that, because never forget, police are just people too, and they are those same mostly good people.
Okay, interesting. I'm going to ask you, David. I'm going to go back on the bomb thing, and we're going to kind of bring it away from the old constitutional jurisprudence and bring it up to today. I'll kind of go back into that, and I'm sorry to bang the same gong about Constitution, not a suicide pact and such. Are you saying that that all humans are trustworthy and that we could trust them with a variety of destructive devices and things are cool, and as long as we all have our own destructive devices, everything's okay?
I mean, absolutely not. Like, obviously, there are people who are untrustworthy. I think a lot of them tend to try to seize power and become a part of the government. But I mean, I've met people I have met people open carrying, and I'm like, oh, you have no business having a gun. But the thing is when you make laws, the people you're going to hurt most are the people who are the most responsible. There's probably very few very responsible, decent people that are also, rebels to the core who will just ignore all the laws. Not that those don't exist. But so, yeah, you can't trust everybody. But when you create laws, you're mostly hurting the people that you can trust. And it's like you come back to the felon thing. This is something that even in gun rights circles, people freak out about. Like, you want to give felons gun rights back? Well, think about it. If a guy just got out of prison and you say he can't have a gun, is the guy you can't trust with a gun going to listen to that? Or is the guy you could trust with a gun going to listen to that? I mean, that's what it comes down to me, is ultimately good people are the ones who generally follow laws. Bad people obviously don't. And so, not that breaking the law necessarily makes you a bad person, but there's certainly a tendency there. So many good people are just not rebels and rule breakers. So what's even the point of the laws, I guess?
All right.
Answers your question.
Brian, I'm going to refer back to your opening statement. I recall that there were a number of additional restrictions that you were hoping. Could you remind me of what those were again?
I'd like to see universal NICS background checks.
Okay.
I would like to see increased permitting, so the option for a sheriff to deny or not, with the option for an appeal back to the justice system. And then I would like to see an increase or a decrease in maximum magazine capacity.
Okay. I think you also talked about earlier domestic violence restriction too.
I did, yeah.
Which we already have.
Right.
Oregon already has universal. I'm going to give myself an extra 10 seconds. All right. Okay. What I was going to say is that Oregon already has universal background checks,
Correct.
Senate Bill 941. We already have the domestic violence,
Yes, we do.
a part of that.
I want to see that nationwide.
Okay. Actually, there is already part of that in the Violence Against Women's Act too.
Right.
Even misdemeanor domestic violence on a federal level prohibits people.
That's what I was going to get at here. But how does this specifically address, how do these calls specifically address what we've had with school mass shootings? Let's take it to where you live today.
Sure.
Okay, I kind of want to get your take on that.
So I think what you are looking at is, I called for some things that weren't gun related either. And I think those may have the greatest impact in school gun violence. Stuff like having mental health counselors. South Medford High School has 2 full-time mental health counselors. And I think they do some amazing work. We should see mental health counselors in every one of our high schools, and we should have some that go around the district too. That into the elementary schools and middle schools. That is something that is lacking that I think we could see a great deal of help from. And then school security, I think we have a school resource officer at our school, Officer Jackson. And Officer Jackson is there. He is part of our school community. Students love him. Students come back to him and say, "Hey, thanks. I was being a little dumber than I should have been, and you helped me out there." And then I truly do think that there will be some. I cannot speak to the number of these that will be stopped because they cannot go to Big Lots or Walmart or wherever else and buy an AR-15 because they don't get the permit from their sheriff or what have you.
Okay. I'm going to direct the next question to you, David, and this has to do with, we can say that, hey, no restrictions, lots of restrictions. Okay, we can probably beat each other's brains in this. What would you say, from a libertarian viewpoint, would actually work to actually reduce the violence in school epidemic? Because, one of the things we're hoping to do is to find a solution or two that might say, from a libertarian view. Oh, I'm hearing myself again.
Well, the number one thing I would say is nothing. Doing nothing is actually decreasing school shooting rates significantly. From that noted pro-gun propaganda rag, NPR, there was recently an article that I read about, the title of it was, "Despite heightened fear of school shootings, it's not a growing epidemic." And if you look at it, in the early 90s, the school shooting rate was like 3 to 4 times what it is today. We just hear about it a lot more now. And if you look at violence across the board, violent crime has been plummeting since like the mid-'80s. The murder rate in America has gone from something like 10.2 in the late 80s to like 4.5, 4.7 today per 100,000 people. It's dropped massively. And society just seems to be getting safer. It seems to be getting more peaceful generally. And murders and shootings are becoming less common, but we hear about them so much more now because we're so much more connected. So I would say that ultimately there's not a whole lot that can or even should be done about these things because they're kind of just freak events that you can't, predict for. I mean, look at countries in Europe are now starting to have issues, and this has happened in America too, with people going out and renting a truck and plowing it into a crowd of people. As long as somebody wants to kill a crowd of people, there are shockingly easy ways to do it. And there's not a whole lot that we can do to prevent it. And should we just inconvenience everybody's life on the gamble that maybe we'll stop some of them? Because ultimately I will say, sure, maybe you'll stop some of them, but you will hurt innocent people in the process through the enforcement of laws that that criminalize victimless actions.
Is it a gun problem or a violence problem?
It's a gun-enabling violence problem.
Gun-enabling violence problem. How so?
You don't have one without the other. You don't have gun violence without guns, and you don't have gun violence without violence. And someone who can go and massacre school children, there is a mental illness there, and that's why we need to address not just the gun side of the gun violence problem, but the violence side of the violence problem as well.
I'm going to ask you a question again, because it's sort of anecdotal in nature here. I'm a little older than you, a lot older than you, but I grew up in a semi-rural area, not all that different from Big Gold Hill, really when it comes right down to it. Had a shooting range behind the high school, and we had guns in the schools all the time. We had guns in the cars. We had guns on the school bus. People would get on the school bus with the rifle because they were on the rifle team. And what do you think has changed has anything changed in the school environment that you were aware of? I know I'm asking you to research, going back
Right.
40, because you're asking for further restrictions, and yet we had the guns, in fact, probably more guns in school then than now, and yet there seems to be more of an issue with the violence. What do you think may have changed?
So, like you said, it is kind of anecdotal, but I can speak to some statistics, I suppose.
Okay.
Mental illness among young people has been on the rise. That might be to attribute to gun attacks in our schools. But then other than that, I can't speak to a lot of change. Our schools are higher stress, I suppose, than they used to be. That's pretty much the consensus among longtime educators. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because that's where I think the argument about, well, it's the availability of guns because we had them all around us, and that you can see how
Right.
someone from but I don't live your life, and that's what I'm trying to
Right.
understand
Yeah.
that.
Thank you.
All right.
I actually have an answer for that too that I'd like to
All right.
get into.
Go ahead.
So we have seen, as I mentioned earlier, a precipitous drop in violent crime and murder in America over the last 30 or so years. In that same time, we have seen the Clinton assault weapons ban come and go, and crime was dropping before it came and continued dropping well after it came, even though the AR-15 and the modern sporting rifle category of firearms became by far the dominant firearm in America. And violence continued to drop. Now, I would never say that's because there are a lot more guns, but I think it makes it hard to draw a correlation. There doesn't seem to be a correlation between America getting far more guns and far superior guns and the violence rate going up. School shootings have also dropped over that time, but what we have seen is that mass shootings have, and I hate to say this, gun rights activists, because a lot of times you guys try to deny this, but a lot of times we have seen mass shootings increase. And I have a theory about this. It's one that's hard to back up, so I'm going to actually back it up with some information about suicide. This is from a website called reportingonsuicide.org. It says, more than 50 research studies worldwide have found that certain types of news coverage can increase the likelihood of suicide in vulnerable victims. This is essentially indisputable. Everyone knows that this happens. Mass shootings are such rare events, it's very hard to, argue that, conclusively at least, that certain types of news coverage would increase them. But we've seen violence go down. We've seen gun ownership and particularly, assault weapon ownership go up. And even though the overall murder rate has gone down, mass shootings have gone up. And I would argue that it's probably because of the way they're being reported on. I think it's not that crazy to compare suicide reporting recommendations to, to this topic. Obviously, we're dealing with mentally unstable people who are usually also suicidal. Not to everybody who's suicidal. Most people who aren't suicidal, obviously, are not a danger to anyone but themselves. But I think this is a really interesting thing to look at.
The public library is closing. Please proceed to the exits on the first floor now.
Never. I believe in freedom. But anyway, so what I was saying was, I think it's pretty clear that we're seeing a lot of copycats. And maybe the fact that we're making freak events such a huge deal in the news and talking about them nonstop is more than anything, more than the proliferation of firearms and the increase we've seen in gun rights over the last few decades. Maybe more than anything, that's why.
All right, I think we know the plan of action tonight, more mental health treatment and also requiring Fox and CNN and everybody to carry nothing but puppy and kitten videos from Facebook, and then I think we'll be okay. We have kidding about that. Hey, do we have any questions, actually from the group? Do we? Oh, we do.
Yeah.
Okay, here.
Just pull those.
I'll just,
Oh, no, them all.
okay, I'll just pull them here. All right, and this is, are they written on the card? Or?
No, it's
King, yeah.
so
Oh.
King of Spades.
Oh, King of Spades. Thank you. King of Spades. Who has the King of Spades? Go ahead. Take it away.
This is for Brian. Brian, you mentioned Massachusetts gun laws,
Yep.
and that they have a background check, and that you have to go through certain protocols to purchase a gun. I'm from Illinois. They have those same laws. Where is one of the places that has the worst gun crime in the country?
Alaska, Wyoming, as far as states go. If you can go to Indiana, buy a gun, then go back into Illinois, it doesn't matter what Chicago's gun laws are.
There's a firearms owner identification card required throughout the entire state of Illinois. You cannot make a purchase of a weapon except through a federally licensed firearms dealer.
Sure. And
And there are no, the city of
Right.
Chicago has tighter restrictions than the outlying counties. And again,
right.
where is the gun crime?
And it
It's not in the outlying counties.
right.
It's not in Indiana where these guns we think are migrating in are happening. So those restrictive laws exist, and they don't reduce the crime in Illinois, nor specifically in Chicago.
If I have a law, I want you to imagine a law that prohibits me from doing something. And then I can drive 20 minutes and do that same thing without following that law is not effective. That's why we need this nationwide. Because it is not as easy to go into Mexico, get a firearm, and bring it back across the border.
All right. Jack of Diamonds. Who's there? Jack of Diamonds. Next question. Okay, we'll make it for both.
Honestly, yeah. I mean, I think it's important to remember, the 9/11 attacks were carried out by people that came here legally, and they still, planned out the worst terrorist attack America's ever seen. If people really want to hurt people, the laws aren't going to stop them. If you have to wait a couple weeks, but you want to get famous and get on TV, I mean, how many of these mass shootings are completely rash events where someone just one day decided, I'm going to go massacre a bunch of people? None of the laws you're proposing would have stopped the Vegas shooter. He was preparing for a long time, and he was a completely law-abiding person. So, again, this to me, it's just these laws are only going to hurt people that aren't going to do bad.
Brian?
So I'm going to respond to what David said really quickly. I have no illusions about this. I know there will still be gun violence in America, but I think focusing on the two roots of the problem, I think, is how you solve that. And then going back to the van problem. Yes, what you were alluding to is that there are licenses for vans and registrations for vans. But what you see is that in other countries, these attacks by firearm, they don't happen because it is harder to get a fire. I mean, they don't happen nearly as often. Let's go with that. There are. I think that should be the last
It's
one.
closed. All right, we know it. Please continue.
And so what you see is that these attacks are less deadly and they happen with less frequency. And so while it may, as far as firearms go, and so while you have other issues to deal with, that doesn't mean we shouldn't deal with this issue.
All right. I will try to reiterate the questions from now on so everybody can hear them then. 10 of diamonds. Who has the 10 of diamonds? We have two 10 of diamonds. All right. I love this card deck. Why don't you go first here? What's that now?
It's for me.
Oh, Brian, okay. Okay. So we're going to see if, can you justify that
Restate it,
90%?
yeah.
Restate the 90%
So
support for universal background checks.
So the question was the 90%, and that was from, I believe it was an Ipsos poll. What I would say is that when you're talking about voting, things muddy the water, but if you just ask somebody before you throw out any sort of advertising or money at all, you just say, are you in support of this issue? They can usually form a fairly coherent representation. And furthermore, I don't think this violates the Constitution. I'm not sure if that's what you were alluding to as far as the 55 restricting the 45, and I think that the Supreme Court would bear that out with me. In 1939, the Supreme Court upheld the National Firearms Act, which restricted heavily automatic weapons, and so I don't think they would have an issue with universal background checks either.
I have a question real quick for Brian.
Yeah, go for
Brian,
it.
are you saying that people put more effort into their answers to phone polls than they do to when they're actually voting and reading a voter's pamphlet and filling out a ballot?
No, what I'm saying is that when you have millions of dollars heading into a race from the NRA or whoever else, people's opinions get skewed to what they wouldn't be if they just formed an opinion on their own.
All right. The other
That's
10
my
of
mom.
diamonds, the other gentleman who was the 10 of diamonds, there were two 10 of diamonds back there? Oh, okay. All right. Well, now it's a queen of diamonds. Who's the queen of diamonds? Queen of diamonds? Queen of diamonds going once. Hello.
First of all, props to you because I'm friends with David on Facebook and never want to get into it. But my question actually is for David because I agree with you on a lot of what you're saying. But part of me wonders if a country where everyone is allowed guns, do you think that it would create a sort of I'm going to shoot you before you shoot me kind of mentality? Because although you believe a lot of people are good, some of us have trust issues.
Okay, so everybody having, once again, everybody having guns, some trust issues involved here. Wouldn't that be a problem?
I wouldn't say that, first of all, I just wouldn't say that believing that people are generally not evil and out to murder a bunch of people doesn't mean I don't have trust issues. Obviously, I have some with the government. Anyway, so what I would say to that is no. I mean, there were very, very, very few gun restrictions, certainly none, really, at the federal level back in the 1800s. And we think of, oh, the Wild West. Well, the Wild West wasn't actually very violent. It had lower murder rates than most places today, for a lot of reasons, not just because everybody was well armed. But I would say no, I carry a gun every day. I know a lot of people who are huge gun rights advocates who don't even do that. I don't think you're ever going to have more than a small percentage of people carrying guns at all times. And generally, people who do carry guns at all times put a little bit of effort into actually training and knowing what they're doing. I mean, so I just think it's kind of a non-issue. I don't see it as being something to be particularly worried about.
Queen of Spades, next. Who's the Queen of Spades? Stand up, loud and proud. Loud and proud.
Okay. Whether we have a constitutional right or not, it is a fact that the United States has the highest rates of gun violence in our developed nations. As someone who I assume cares about the lives of others, and especially about children, what do you propose that we do to fix that rate? This gentleman already said nothing, but if you do have any other thoughts, then that would be great, because we do have a problem.
Well, so what I would say is...
Okay, you talked, just so people can hear on the video, high gun violence rate, and
How do we fix
how
it?
do we fix it then?
Well, what I would say is that, indisputably, the murder rate and the gun violence rate has been going down for... No, that's absolutely false. Regulations have not gone up. We have seen a great increase in concealed carry rights and constitutional carry rights around the country. The Clinton assault weapon ban started in 1994 and heavily restricted AR-15 style weapons.
Let him
We
talk,
have in
let
like
him
the last
talk.
year. That started in 2016, and I guess I'm not quite understanding. Do you guys have another question? Can you clarify your question a little bit? I guess I'm not understanding.
So
So you don't agree that we have a problem, a gun violence problem in our nation?
Not particularly. I think there's a lot of problems that contribute to America having a higher murder rate than other countries, and I think that very little of it has to do with the proliferation of firearms, particularly modern sporting firearms. AR-15s, rifles as a whole are only used in about 2% of all murders, and AR-15s are only one small subset of rifles. I think you need to look at things like the war on drugs. The war on drugs drives far more murders. What'd you say, ma'am? Well, no, I think there are reasons that America has a higher murder rate than other countries. I'm just saying I don't think it has anything to do with guns, and I can give you some statistics on why I think that. Well, could you please listen, ma'am, if you're going to ask me a question? What I'm trying to say is that the war on drugs, it's very hard to find research on this, but it's pretty inarguable that the war on drugs drives a lot of murders. If we ended the war on drugs, which fuels gang warfare, which fuels police shootings of citizens, that would cut down on America's homicide rate significantly. Look at the example of Australia and New Zealand. Australia had a huge, tragic mass shooting in 1996 and immediately went out and enacted very strict gun control laws. And their crime went down, and people cite that as an example of gun control working. And let me show you why that doesn't actually make that much sense. Let me find my notes here. Okay, so Australia and New Zealand are geographically very close. They're culturally similar, and they're very similar socioeconomically. They have very similar rates of firearms ownership. Australia has 24.1 guns per 100 citizens. New Zealand has 22.6. There was a study done by Samara McPhedran and Jeannie Baker and published in the Justice Policy Journal in 2008. And here's an excerpt from their abstract. The current paper examines the incidence of mass shootings in Australia and New Zealand, a country that is socioeconomically similar to Australia, but with a different approach to firearms regulation over a 30-year period. It does not find support for the hypothesis that Australia's prohibition of certain types of firearms has presented mass shootings, with New Zealand not experiencing mass shooting either since 1997, despite the availability in that country of firearms banned in Australia. I would also encourage you to look at what happened in that same time period where Australia's murder rate went down. Australia in 1989 had a murder rate of 1.8 per 100,000, and in 2014 that was 1 per 100,000. The United States in 1991 had a murder rate of 9.8 that had previously peaked at 10.2 in 1980. And yet, in 2014, the murder rate had dropped in America to 4.5 per 100,000. In the same time that Australia enacted severe gun control laws, their murder rate decreased 45%. America did not institute those laws and actually ended up having tons and tons more assault weapons during that period, and yet our murder rate actually decreased 55%. I'm not saying that the additional guns made the murder rate go down. I'm saying there's not the correlation that you guys think there is. It just doesn't hold out.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Are you aware that the rate of the decrease did in fact speed up once the Brady handgun ban was implemented? Or the Brady bill.
And you mean, and what was the Brady bill exactly? Background checks? Refresh me.
It was background checks. There was a mandatory waiting period, and that one got struck down. And then there was also, that's off the top of my head.
I don't think the Brady bill did a ton as far as, when you say the Brady bill, you're talking about the Clinton assault weapons ban from 94 to 2004?
No, it's a different bill.
A different, okay, well. I'd
it's
have
a
to check that
handgun
out.
bill.
Maybe you can track that, but that seems pretty coincidental to me because we've seen the entire first world, basically, the entire West has had their murder rates decrease at pretty comparable rates. So I would say that you need to be really careful about drawing I mean, just like I'm not saying that the proliferation of AR-15s has driven down our murder rate.
Right.
I think it would be kind of equally silly to say that, oh, the Brady bill right here drove down the murder rate when, I mean, the Brady bill can exist all at once. There's a lot more guns now than there were in 1990.
Can I answer the question?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So I do think there's a problem. Like I said, you're looking at a comparable rate to breast cancer in the population, and so I think there is a problem, and I think there are ways to address this problem, and I think that includes the laws that I've laid out, the greater access to mental health care, and greater security for our schools.
What would you see as greater security for your school? How do you define that?
So there are a few schools that are security nightmares. You can get in pretty much anywhere, and it makes it difficult to secure the campus. And so at South Medford High School, we have lots of entrances, but we also have fences.
So that's technically a security
Right,
nightmare in a way, isn't it?
So, but what I was actually on a student safety panel, and what the student safety panel did is we decided that most of the doors were going to remain locked during the school day. That way that people couldn't just enter from any which door they please. They had to go by the office. And what that does is that just gives a few more seconds to a minute more of time where students can try to duck and cover, try to protect themselves. And then also looking at not just having lockdown drills. So what we've done, what I've been practicing since I entered kindergarten, is you hide in a corner and you turn off the lights, you lock the door, you shut the blinds, and you pretend like the bad guy isn't there, and you hope that he doesn't know you're there either. But he's there on a Thursday because he knows schools are in session at 11 o'clock on a Thursday. And so there's a new kind of training. It's called Alice training, or it might be called Run, Hide, Fight. And so it encourages students to, if you can get away, get away. If you can't, shelter in place. And if you have to, throw a book at the guy who comes in your door with an AR-15. And so that's a security measure just as much as a fence is.
Would you feel okay about teachers being armed? I know that was a controversy within the
Right.
Medford district a few years ago.
It was. So what I would say to that is that people don't feel like that would increase safety, but I'm totally okay with police officers being on campus as our school resource officers, and those people being armed. I think those people are separate enough from the community that there are a few not great options with a teacher who's armed. It's either on the teacher, and you can tackle them from behind because teachers have to teach. They can't be on a swivel the whole entire day. That's not going to happen. And so you could it's either on them and it's pretty easy to take, or it's locked away, and what happens when the gunman comes through the door and it's locked in their desk. And so with teachers, there's a few not great options, and with police officers, I think there are better options.
Okay.
Can I interject there?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So, Brian, I'm curious. Why are you, you talk about a teacher? Oh, it'd be so easy to take their gun. Well, a teacher would be concealing, whereas a school resource officer would be carrying openly. So, if someone was ever going to be a target for tackling and taking of their gun, why would you, why wouldn't you be worried about putting more resource officers in schools?
Because, quite frankly, I think that school resource officers aren't as close with the students. They aren't going to be the ones that crouch down at the desk and say, well, no, 2 + 2 isn't 5. Come on, we talked about this. And so I think it's that closeness that makes a teacher an easier target and makes it more likely that a student knows that teacher is concealed carry, and they can push down the one teacher that's 63 and 4'8" and 90 pounds.
Okay.
So I have another question.
Okay, go ahead.
Here, just on the topic of school safety. So here's some statistics, and I won't go through every year because that would take too long. But in the 1992 to 1993 school year, there were 0.55 students per million shot and killed at school. And in between that time and now, it's gone down a lot. From the 2014 to 2015 school year, the rate was about 0.15 per million. That's a decrease of over 3 times.
Okay, so the overall rate's down, though, but wouldn't you concede that the quantity, I think even you yourself, though, said the mass incidents have gone up?
Well, no, I'm actually talking specifically here about school shootings. School shootings have become much less common today than they used to be. Mass shootings as a whole, you can argue, have gone up.
Okay.
So there is a difference. We're talking specifically about school shootings here. So we've gone from, in the early 90s, 0.55 students per million being shot and killed, to in the current day, it's more like 0.15 per million. Okay. So this is, again, an issue where the incidence rate of this crime has dropped dramatically. And it seems to me that we're just more worried about it because we're hearing about it more. I mean, remember, too, most of these school shootings are like one person being shot at a school, at, a gang-related thing or something. So my question is, in light of the fact that school shootings have gone down, why should we be raising our kids to be afraid? Why should we be putting more cops in schools? Why should we be turning schools more into a prison, essentially? Is that really a healthy way to raise kids? Is that really conducive to learning?
I go to school in a school that you would describe as a prison, and I am one of the top 160 students in this nation, as deemed by the United States Presidential Scholar Program. And so
you're an outlier. What about, look at all the other kids. What is South Medford? How does it compare? I honestly don't know. How does South Medford compare as a whole?
So it's got a mid to upper 80s graduation rate, depending on the year, which is better than the state average of, I believe, mid 70s. It is doing pretty well in standardized test scores. It's doing all right in standardized. We'll go with all right.
Okay, good on language arts.
Yeah.
Math and science, pretty poor, actually.
We have some great extracurriculars. And so what I would say is that growing up in these schools that would be deemed a prison, a few gates doesn't make a prison.
Okay. I want to get to some more of the audience questions so we can get rolling here. Jack of Spades, stand up. Let's hear from you. Jack of Spades. Yes, go ahead.
Hey, David.
I have a question actually for the both of you.
Okay.
And then just a side note, I would like, while we're all here, specifically talk about a recent stay. Keep going back to how I was today. I have a question for Brian, and I have a question for David. My question for Brian would be, most of your Parkland advocates are for the AR-15 ban. Tell me why you're not, and reiterate that. As far as David goes, I know you mentioned people out of prison
Okay, so why don't we have you? Why are you okay with the AR-15 when most of the Parkland people are not?
So, as has been mentioned tonight, if you ban the AR-15, they're just going to go to a Mini 14. If you ban a Mini 14, they're just going to go to a little 22 that you know, Grandpa's got to shoot the squirrels or whatever else gets in the house. And so, I think it's not going to be you're not going to see the effectiveness that you want with just a blanket ban. What you're going to see is much more effective, I believe, is really looking at how people purchase firearms, who is purchasing those firearms, and what do we do about people who have committed acts of violence against others.
All right, David, defend the felons get their guns back.
Yeah, as far as that goes, I would say, first of all, I think that a lot of what can land you in prison these days shouldn't be landing anybody in prison. Look at how many people are in prison for drugs. As a staunch libertarian, I think it's wrong to throw people in a cage for what they put into their body. So I don't think that some guy who got arrested for marijuana should be deprived of his gun rights. And again, it just comes down to the exact same logic that all of us gun rights advocates use all the time. If guns were banned, only outlaws would have guns.
All right, would you let me redirect then? Violent felons. They've already shown a propensity of violence. What do you say then?
If they're going to be violent again, not letting them have guns is not going to stop them.
All right.
They'll either get a gun or they'll be violent without one.
The Joker. Joker. Who has it? Hi.
I'm a second grade teacher. We had a lockdown earlier this year, and it was not planned. My students went to the table crying, and I really wish I had a way to defend myself and my students.
Okay. Who would you like to direct this question to?
Probably me.
It's just not really a question. That was a statement in reference to the other discussion.
Okay, so you're a second grade teacher and you had a lockdown recently and everyone's hiding on their kids are crying and you actually wished for a way to defend yourself?
I think that teachers should be able to carry, and I'm a really good shot, and I don't think that every teacher should be.
The one thing I would just mention is, and these the two folks here can respond if they want, but you actually can carry. It is legal for you to do so. It is your school board.
They may take your job, but they can't send you to jail. So,
All
it's,
right. All right, either of you want to?
Yeah.
And it's kind of been covered a little bit, but don't you think that the criminals are going to do what they want to do, whether there's a law or not?
What I would say to that is,
Yeah, won't the criminals
Yeah,
do what
so-
what
yeah,
criminals
so-
are going to do?
what I would say to the criminals doing whatever they want is that people don't commit acts of violence nearly as often as they used to with machine guns. And that's because there are less machine guns. It's hard to get a machine gun. It's expensive. I'm sure some people in this room could tell you how expensive it is. And so there are definitely things that criminals can't surmount. Well,
I'll gladly put machine guns on
my-
trial.
My
We should be
opponent
able to get
believes
them.
that, yeah, machine guns should be able to be owned by anyone and everyone. You should be able to go buy them at a Walmart if Walmart wants to sell them.
I think we do need to remember that, machine guns have been extremely heavily restricted. There's been a $200 tax on them since 1934, which in 1934 would have far exceeded the cost of any machine gun. And then since 1986, Ronald Reagan, actually, one of the ways that he was not the pro-gun guy that everyone thinks he was.
Good conservative.
He passed. He oversaw the passing of the Hughes Amendment, which made it so that no new automatic weapons could be transferred into civilian hands. So any legal automatic weapon today is basically from pre-1986. What I would say to that is that, in 1934, it wasn't like today where we have a culture where people own AR-15s. Back then, no one really owned machine guns. There were just very few of them in circulation, and then they became really hard to get. So was it really an issue that there weren't? Like, did it really stop much? Is that what I'm trying to say? I guess. I don't think so.
Okay.
It's
King
not
of
a non-issue.
Diamonds. King of Diamonds, I want to make sure everybody gets in here tonight. Go ahead. Oh, glad you're here. Go ahead and say, ring it out loud and proud, okay? Okay, so if I could just condense this is almost like something I've mentioned before. How can you defend the myth of authority? Is that kind of what? Okay.
I'm
yeah,
gonna get. I want David to say it first because I think his answer is going to be they don't have the authority.
Yeah, well, I'll go ahead and answer it first then. What I would say to that is that the use of force, violence, is only justified to protect the life, liberty, or property of innocent people. And when the state is doing that, I don't particularly have an objection to it. And when they're not doing that, I do. And and I'm very absolute about that. I think that if you cannot identify a real victim in a crime or a crime that there is clear evidence is being planned, I don't think that the government has any authority to do anything. No, at least no rightful authority. All they have is force and their might.
So what I would say is, as far as the federal government goes, you have the Interstate Commerce Clause, which has been broadly interpreted to mean anything that the federal government can regulate anything that has implications outside of any state. And so anytime there's money that moves any direction or that money may move any direction outside of a state, they have the ability to regulate that. And so that's what I would say is you get it from that Interstate Commerce Clause.
All right. Ace of spade. No, make that ace of clubs. I'm not a card player. Sorry. Ace of clubs. Ace. Hi.
America is 5% of the world's population, but owns 50% of the world's guns. Inside of our nation, we have about 30% of our households are gun owners, and of that 30%, half of the guns are owned by 3% of the people. So 3% of the population, American population, is stockpiling massive amounts of guns.
And what's your question?
The question,
No, I'm just trying to get to a question. That's all.
do you think that we have a right to know who that 3% is?
All right. It's a great question. And
I'll start.
okay, why don't you go ahead and start, Brian?
If they haven't committed a crime, I don't think they do. I think that falls under your right to privacy, and I do not think that law would be upheld if it went to the Supreme Court or many other courts, to be quite honest.
Yeah, I mean, ma'am, I'll be Brian, I do appreciate you saying that. That's a very reasonable thing to say. Ma'am, I would just say that I think that that you should do some research and see who commits crimes and who, what kinds of gun owners commit crimes. By far, most gun crimes are committed with the cheapest, most basic firearms you can get. Smith & Wesson 38 is like tops the list of FBI, most commonly used guns and crimes every year. It's not AR-15s and stuff. It's not the super collectors, people like myself and probably a lot of people in this room who own double-digit numbers of firearms. We aren't the ones committing crimes. I mean, I think even anyone on the anti-gun side of this debate who's being honest with themselves would be forced to admit that. So I don't know why you would need to know what someone who's probably one of the most upstanding people you're going to ever meet would, what they do with their private life.
Can I interject one more time? And also to be quite honest, if you take my position and you say that we should do these background checks and we should make sure that only people that are not going to be a danger to the community should have firearms, you shouldn't be worried about how many they have. If we have decided that these people can own firearms because they haven't committed crimes, they aren't a danger to themselves or others, then it doesn't matter if they have 20 of them.
I would just like to.
Hey, we've actually found a little bit of common ground here. I'm amazed. All right.
I'd have to double check and look this up again, but the statistic I've heard, I believe, is that police are actually like 7 times more likely to break the law than your average concealed handgun license holder. I mean, the people who are the most seriously into guns are almost invariably the least likely to be breaking the law.
So I guess the question is, how do you find the people most likely to break the law? Isn't that really the question?
Yeah, well, yeah. I suppose.
When they're breaking the law, because we don't have pre-crime and we never should.
One more. Ace of Hearts. Who has the Ace of Hearts? Go ahead.
Kind of a two-part question. You said you're for restrictions of high-capacity magazines.
Right.
What is a high-capacity magazine?
So I
So
would,
what is a
yeah.
high-capacity magazine? We'll reiterate
Yeah.
that again.
I would define. I take 15 rounds for a rifle is where I draw the line for a high-capacity magazine.
And what? So AR-15, for example, when they were first made, 30-round magazines what they came with, so it's
Right.
actually considered standard capacity.
Right.
With several other guns holding more than 15 rounds. Parkland shooter was 10-round magazines.
Right.
So one thing I think about is when California enacted their 10-round magazine ban, I'd always kind of laughed at the thought of all the gang members in South Central, throwing their magazines away because wanted 10 rounds. So if you're at home and you want to defend yourself, having the criminals, they're already breaking the law. They're not going to care that, they're going to want a 30-round magazine or whatever, 100-round drum, whatever you want to say. So the law-abiding citizens like myself and every other person in this room would want the best chance for an even playing field.
Okay, so let me see if I can just rephrase that briefly then. Criminals are not going to obey magazine restrictions anyway. Parkland shooter used 10-round magazines and still was able to create quite a bit of mayhem.
Yeah.
We know that. So
yeah.
how can you defend the high capacity restriction?
So going to the Parkland shooter, I do think that him using a 10-round magazine opposed to a 100-round drum, and I think his weapon jammed at one point and some students were able to get away. I think those things, they probably did save lives. Even if it's 1 or 2, that is 1 or 2 more American dreams than we would have had otherwise. And going specifically to leveling the playing field, something that we have been really bad at as a nation is having sustained long-term trials that weeded these things out of regular circulation. I'm not going to say that's going to happen in 10 years even, but eventually it will happen. And so what I would say about gangsters not throwing away their 30-round clips is that eventually those clips will make their way out, and then they won't have any more 30-round clips, and the playing field will be level.
Are you familiar with 3D printing?
I am familiar with 3D printing. We have one at our school.
I mean, it's not very hard to manufacture magazines, and the history of mass shooters is full of people who did not use high-capacity magazines. Yeah. Virginia Tech was the largest one for a long time, and he used a Glock 19 and a Walter P22, 2 handguns, mostly using 10-round magazines. He had a few 15-rounders. One of the first really, widely spread stories of a mass shooter was Charles Whitman in the 1960s. Was at the Texas A&M, whichever one it was, clock tower. He was using like a Remington 600, and yes, not a 700, it was a 600, I believe, bolt-action rifle, from the top of a clock tower, and then an M1 carbine, which probably only had 15-round magazines. I mean, I could go on. There's so many examples of this.
And I suppose I'd be willing to re-examine this position in particular, because it is something that many people feel very strongly about, and that I think would do some very very good things. But if we reevaluated and we couldn't find empirical evidence after a sustained period where these didn't exist, I'd be okay with reevaluating. I think that's what we have to do, is we have to look at empirical evidence, and if it doesn't work with what we've been doing, we have to reevaluate. We want to solve problems. We don't want to stick in our sides.
So I actually have a question for Brian, real quick, if I can throw it in there. Obviously, Brian, you have a lot more trust in the government than I do, but there is one area where I will give you that, I think the government can do some good. When the government supports a minority group and, gives them protection against a majority, I think that's one of the few good things that government can do. So you bring up a lot this issue of, it's the will of the people. 90% of people want to have this or that. How do you reconcile that with the government's role of, protecting minority groups of all kinds, be they racial, religious, or in this case, what we choose to own?
Right. What I would say to that is we have a restriction. It's called the Second Amendment. It is the thing that restricts the government's ability to interfere with firearm ownership and, in my opinion, membership in the militia. And as long as you are working within that, the government is doing their job of protecting those rights. And we can get into a moral debate, but as far as just the strict legal debate, the government is protecting the rights as long as they stay within that Second Amendment.
I mean, I would agree with that, but I think shall not be infringed is pretty clear. But
Well,
that's.
the Supreme
But I don't want to
Court
get back
disagrees.
to the Federalist Papers.
All right. Any quick questions from people who didn't give us any cards? All right. We'll see if we can just kind of roll through it. I'll go right to left here. Go ahead. Gentleman in the light T-shirt. Okay, drugs are banned, and we still get them, in many cases. And how can
I don't want to ban guns. And so I can't speak to that position specifically. Sure. Like I said, I'm going to go back to automatic firearms. People don't commit crimes with automatic firearms. It's too hard. And so it has proven pretty effective with automatic firearms in particular.
Of course, there's automatic firearms on those TV shows all the time. It's amazing, the easy availability of that. Next, go ahead, please.
My name is Mark Wells.
Hey, Mark.
1992, my father, who was a state tax auditor for Oregon, Frank Wells, was gunned down, Grant's house, 3-time Vietnam vet. When the 357 ballistics came back, I asked the police, how could this guy who was a felon have gotten a hold of that 357? Well, it was because he broke into somebody's house and stole it. Can you please tell me, Brian, how the stricter gun laws would have stopped that?
Okay, so father died, 357, by a felon who had
Right.
stolen the firearm.
What I would say to that is that goes to responsible gun ownership. Making sure that you don't keep your gun locked away in your glove box, because that's a window away from someone who shouldn't have a firearm having that firearm. Making sure that it is kept in a secure location, that it isn't going to get stolen from.
All right. Paul, go ahead. Paul Princeton.
Brian, I was concerned when you said that the police, you weren't emphasizing the protection, but you did emphasize the enforcement. I'm European. I studied war. The war my parents were in, that family lost there. It's the enforcement that was pushed by Nazi Germany. And the thing was, government, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, and it rolled over all these people, and millions lost their lives. I'm real concerned that you're into this enforcement thing, because that's exactly how they did it. I
Well,
commend you
so-
on being such an excellent student, and I think you very well give voice to the desired outcome of education as it stands right now, which is a high degree
Okay, Paul,
So I think the question is, why did I place so much emphasis on enforcement when that has led to issues in the past? And what I would say is that we have to be enforcing laws that, one, do not violate our Constitution. That is our set of rights, the thing that is inalienable, the thing that makes America so great. And second, we have to have laws that reflect the morals of the nation. It cannot be a group in the minority taking cues from or it can't be a group in the majority and a slim majority taking away the rights of those, and that falls under more the Constitution, I suppose. But we have to make sure that the laws that we enforce are moral, and opposed to enforcing laws that are not.
Jim, you had a question, I think, and I'll get to you in the back too, just a second, okay? All right.
First off, I want to say these two young men give an old man like me hope.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Brian, you made a statement about smuggling weapons into the U.S.
Right.
Have you ever been to the southern border?
I have not ever actually stepped foot on the southern border.
I worked there 14 years. Brian Terry would disagree with you about automatic weapons that people use. They are.
Yeah, are you familiar with Brian Terry's experience?
I'm not.
Yeah, border control guard who died.
Yes.
Wasn't this the case?
Yeah, he was in a gunfight. He was killed with an AK-47 automatic weapon. They come across there unbelievable amounts in both directions. So how would you stop that?
So
Yeah, how would you stop a
Yeah.
cross-border smuggling like that, since there's
I
so
can tell
much
you how I'd
emphasis?
stop that.
What?
End the war on drugs. That guy was killed because of the war on drugs. Period.
fair enough. I would agree with that. I mean, we obviously have to control what comes in and out of our country. Even if we ended the war on drugs, we'd still want to tax and regulate those
Not
drugs
all
coming
of
over
us.
the border. No, well, okay, sure, but the government would want to, and so
Convincing
that it's very unfortunate about Brian, and obviously we need to address that with greater border security and making sure that things can't just come across the border.
Gentleman in the back.
Yeah, Brian, I had a couple questions for you. My first question is, do you know how many people were killed or injured in the Nice, France cargo truck attack?
I don't have specific numbers on
Yeah, the Nice truck attack. How many?
86 killed, run over by a cargo truck, 458 injured. My question for you, Brian, is what is your preferred implement of violence? If you say gun violence and guns and violence go together, you can't have gun violence without guns. What's your preferred implement of violence?
So as I think the question was, if I wasn't going to use a gun, what would I use? Is that what you're getting to, or just?
Yeah, preferred implement of violence, right?
What would you prefer people use?
So I would prefer that people don't use anything, I think is my answer. But I mean that's not going to happen, but that doesn't mean we can't limit the ways that it can.
Okay, I'll do a follow-up to that if you don't mind. Since we haven't been able to repeal the laws of human nature, in
Sure.
any time, any recent history here, how would you then have people defend themselves from people who did want to commit violence against them? Maybe that's a better question.
Yeah. So this is probably going to, get a firearm. If you can, under what I've laid out tonight, get a firearm, use that. Defend yourself with that firearm.
Gentlemen in the America shirt. Oh, I like your America shirt, by the way. Okay. Anybody else here? Okay, we have a couple here. Go ahead, gentleman in front.
Got a couple of questions, actually, one for Brian, one for David.
Yeah.
You give us an inch, we're gonna take a mile. That, for the most part, I think your views are tempered by Southern Oregon, thank goodness. But for the most part, from what I've seen, is they want all assault weapons gone. We have legislation in Salem they're trying to ban outright. I think it's the first time I've seen it where you got 90 days to turn it in. How do you explain the difference and the major portion of the group, not
Right.
notwithstanding, going for that?
So it would be fair then to explain his point of view on the March for Our Lives versus what the bulk, the overall tenor
Right.
of the march,
Um,
which was very much confiscation, get rid of it all, and be Michael Bloomberg's, wet dream, I guess.
I would disagree with that particular characterization of the march. But what I would say is that, as with any political thing, you're not going to agree with someone 100%. We have someone running for state senate right here in the room, Jessica Gomez. Thank you for coming. And there are a lot of people who are going to vote for Ms. Gomez next week in the primary, and they're not going to agree with all of her positions, but they're still going to associate themselves with her, and they're still going to say, she's the one that I want to get behind.
Can I add a little follow-up question to that?
Sure.
Okay, sorry, I just have something for Brian.
Yeah.
So, now, Brian, I know that you're not in favor of, like, a total assault weapons ban. You're more about the background checks. But, if 90% of the population was polled and wanted to ban assault weapons, what would you say then? Would you support that?
Amend the Constitution. Well, I mean, actually, I wouldn't say amend the Constitution. What I would say is that according to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is one of the most upheld circuit courts in the nation, according to that circuit court, an assault weapons ban isn't illegal. And if that's something that a state or a nation wanted to pursue and 90% of people support it, then I suppose it could be passed, and it should be passed into law.
Since the Second Amendment is
He's got a question for.
Oh, okay.
This is the other part. I don't know what Alexander Hamilton's views were on the militia and standing armies. I was more of a Harrisburg fan.
Me too. Well, not really, just the one thing.
But what do you think the founding fathers with militia, why were they not talking about the armies? I know most of the founding fathers despised standing armies. And today, should we be more like Switzerland, where probably 50% of the houses have a fully automatic true assault rifle in them?
Okay, in the interest of time, we'll reiterate this. Founding fathers were not big on standing armies, apparently. It's still back on the militia. What do you think about
Hamilton
more of
didn't
a-
like him either.
Well, what do you think more about a Swiss model, the
Well,
Canton model?
I certainly would never want, mandatory conscription in the military, which is what Switzerland really has. I think that's an egregious violation of liberty. I don't know if I necessarily argue I want to be like Switzerland. I just want to be free. I want people to be able to choose what they have in their house. And if they want to have a machine gun like I do, great. And if they don't, more power to them.
All right, let's see. Thank you. Let's go with you next, okay? Mr. America.
My name's Teddy Garner. I'm a 3-year veteran of the United States Air Force and a 3-year veteran of the United States Army. First, Brian, I have to commend you, all right? It takes a lot of courage to get up in front of a group of
Thank
people
you.
like this, and you knew most would probably be gun others, okay? You're a very highly intelligent young man, first and foremost. And I would like to offer for you to come out sometime and actually, in a controlled environment with an actual instructor, and shoot an AR-15 with a 30-round magazine.
I've got a father who is a police officer. I've done that very thing.
Okay, so, excellent. The thing I have to ask you, all right, the idea behind hopefully they're gonna run out of 30-round magazines, David touched on, okay? They're gonna have any capable way to get rid of that. And then we touched on the smuggling, which is another thing, all right? So, what I'm trying to get at here is human nature will always have evil in it. Okay. And the major thing that we haven't addressed is our youth today.
So speaking just generally to mental health care and how do we address that issue, like I said, I want to see greater access in our schools. I want to see greater community access too, because it isn't just students who have mental health issues, and it's not just students who shoot up nightclubs or whatever else, and students become adults eventually, and we should have continuing mental health care and mental health resources for those people.
And I believe there's a lady in the back. Go ahead.
Hi, so I heard you guys briefly talk about, Eric, that the best way for a woman to defend herself against an abuser is to get a gun, or she was denied to do that. Am I expected to go out and get a gun to defend the man who abused me who also had a gun? Is that the only way to get there to be safe?
No, I mean, I wouldn't think so. If you don't want to own a gun, you don't have to. Obviously, it's not like the onus is on. It's not like you're wrong for not having a gun to protect yourself. He's wrong for hurting you. But what I would say, and I think anybody who's being realistic has to agree to this, most men could hurt most women without a firearm. In fact, actually, let me do a little bit of audience participation for a second. Who in here is over 75 years old? Put up your hand. Okay, who in here has some kind of, or keep your hands up, sorry, I'm make a point here. Who in here has some kind of like a mobility or disability or something? How about who in here weighs less than 150 pounds? Right, we're getting like half the room at this point. I mean, I would argue that firearms are an equalizer. And this is getting a little bit away from your question, because to be frank, I don't know that there's really much answer to your question. I'm sorry if you were assaulted by someone with a gun. My point is just that firearms are an equalizer. They are how people who cannot otherwise protect themselves can protect themselves. And I think that's an extremely important thing that we shouldn't forget.
All right, I think we're going to, okay, one more.
Speaking to that same question, as a female and using your words, leveling the playing field, would you said you only support background checks.
Right.
Would you support the repeal of the pistol age increase to 21? As a female under 21, you're out there going to college, as many of your classmates would
Right.
go,
Okay.
and now you're vulnerable.
All right, so I'll just, I'll re-say the question based on, for the video, based on the fact that equalizing the playing field, would you be in favor of repealing the pistol restriction to age 21 and bringing it back down to 18 where it once was?
Honestly, my opinion is not well enough informed on the matter. I don't know what that pistol age increase did for the gun violence rate, and that's something that we could look at. But if it had a real impact, then it is protecting people.
So can I ask you a question, Brian?
Yeah, go for it.
Is the main thing that matters to you when it comes to legislation, is it just all about the numbers? Is it all about, did that cut down on deaths? Did that cut down on crime? Is that the most important thing?
To me, what it's about is it's a two-pronged approach, and sometimes these prongs run against each other, and that makes it hard. But it's putting things into law that do not violate our constitutional rights and that people want, but also making a positive difference. And I think that every life saved, I like to hammer home on this. That's one more person that's a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, or anything else.
Well, the second part of what I was going to say is that the CDC statistics show that women in a year use a gun to protect themselves against rape over 200,000 times.
So 200,000 times that firearm used to prevent rape in women, according to the CDC. Pretty strong.
I would be very
Piece of
shocked
evidence.
by that, to be totally honest, because the CDC until this year was banned on doing any meaningful research into guns. It's called the Dickey Amendment. It was recently repealed, and prior to that, the CDC's hands were pretty much tied. So I'd have to look that up.
I would encourage you to, because that's,
Okay.
I mean, the CDC is also, the Obama era CDC even has actually, sort of, they did some studies that actually weren't released. I don't want to get into it here, but there's more behind that whole Dickey Amendment thing than I think people realize.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I really want to thank you for coming tonight. And if you could put it together, just two great people discussing this issue, Brian Josephson and David Kirk West. We thank you so much for coming tonight, and we'll keep talking about it on the radio on KMED and KCMD too. And do we want to do anything else here?
Yeah, but before we end here, could we have Ron come back up here real quick?
Oh.
And then could we have Gabe? Could you bring up the donation? Just want to see how much we got together. Do you guys have it all? Okay, gotcha. Okay, well then we'll do it afterwards. Yeah, because I have some stuff here too. So.
Yeah.
Maybe on the way out.
Well,
All
on the
right.
way out, people, if you can, please donate to Helping Hands International. It's a real great organization.
Thank you all for coming.
Brian, thank you. David, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. Brian, well done. You made it hard. A lot of my preparations I didn't even get to.